Is it the hopelessness that blocks them from seeing that there is actual recovery here?
Yes, and I think that that's part of the issue. When you don't believe that you can make positive change and that anything that you can do would make a difference, you won't engage.
What is atypical depression?
So atypical depression is a specifier of depression. So this is when somebody meets the criteria for a major depressive disorder or a persistent depressive disorder, but they have these additional features that make it really different from basically what we consider a regular course of depression. So with somebody who has atypical depression, they have a couple of other interesting features, like oftentimes they will have what we call leaden paralysis, where they feel kind of like their body feels very heavy, their limbs feel heavy, and they will actually talk about that as occurring with some of their other depressive symptoms. And they also have a very heightened interpersonal sensitivity during their depressive episodes, so that they're extremely afraid of rejection, so much more so than just their average run-of-the-mill low self-esteem. And so those two things, when they occur together, and yet this person also does have what we call mood reactivity, which means that if somebody tells them a joke, they can brighten up for a few minutes. And if you do something pleasant with them, they can actually say, oh, I felt pretty good during that hour, and then I got depressed again. And so it's not that they can't feel the full range of emotions while they're depressed, but that these other features of interpersonal rejection being very heightened about that, and this leaden paralysis are oftentimes some of the other characteristics of this type of depression.
So atypical depression allows you to experience a range of emotions, even if it's just temporary. But major depressive disorder does not?
It may or may not.
It may or
for
may
some
not.
individuals, when they're really depressed, it's so hard for them to get there.
Yes.
But with atypical depression, they do have the reactivity. So they can be stimulated into laughter and feeling pretty good, but again, for short periods of time, and then they kind of go back into that depressed state.
And in someone's life, if they were diagnosed with, because I was diagnosed with depression when I was 9. I've never heard of any of this stuff.
Right.
So as someone goes through their depression journey, can they move in and out of these different subtypes?
Yes, and sometimes I think when they're in some of these subtypes, they feel even more despondent because sometimes they don't respond to the same courses of medications and they don't respond to the same courses of treatment. And there is some research that shows that atypical specifier, when you have some of these symptoms, that certain types of antidepressants might actually not work as well for you, that maybe you need to try other types of antidepressants. So again, the first line antidepressants that are SSRIs sometimes don't work as well for some of these subtypes of depression. And so you have to try things like SNRIs or atypical antidepressants like TCAs, and they sometimes will respond much better to those medication strategies.
So it could be possible then that when somebody goes into their doctor's office, gets diagnosed with depression, they get started on an SSRI, they're fine for 6 months, they have a noticeable symptom reduction, and then they say the meds stop working. It could be that the depression has shifted and the meds that you're taking do not treat this type of depression that you've now shifted into.
Exactly. So before you kind of lose hope about that, maybe just make sure that you're talking to your doctor or your provider about, hey, I feel like I have a couple of these other symptoms that didn't really present as part of my depression last year. So
that's critical.
Can we kind of talk about this and look into it more?
Excellent. When it comes to treating atypical depression through non-medication means, what are the options and what should people know?
Well, I think a big part of it is addressing the interpersonal sensitivity component, you know, really making sure that you buff up the social skills training and the interpersonal effectiveness skill sets when you're doing behavioral treatment. And also the leaden paralysis, because it's really weird for them to kind of experience these body or very somatic based symptoms. And so in that case, maybe somatic experiencing might be really helpful as an adjunctive behavioral non-medicinal treatment to make sure that you address that symptom.
The recovery time, this is huge for people. They don't feel good. They want to feel better today. Realistically, when can people start feeling better?
I think people need to give it at least 1 to 2 months. And you have to be patient with the interventions, because a lot of the medications take 2 to 4 weeks to even work. And if you're trying different medications, if the first one doesn't hit, you got to try a second one. Sometimes it takes a combination of medications, at least in the short duration. And so be patient with yourself. The behavioral interventions will help out to some degree, even the day that you're in therapy, but sometimes to see those longer lasting benefits, it does take a little while for you to work on those skills and to get better at using them when you're in distress.
If you like psychology and learning about mental health and want to learn more while meeting other people who are interested, explore your membership options using the link below this video or visit MedCircle.com.
Now, I may have more questions about atypical depression as we continue this conversation, but let's move to the melancholic depression. Never heard of this. What is this?
Yeah, so the melancholic depression kind of sounds a little bit like the name. So this is a type of depression that is characterized by a deep sense of despondency and moroseness, very, very significant hopelessness that is associated with this type of depression. This type of individual will have a lot less reactivity to positive events. So their mood will not brighten as easily when you tell them a joke or when you take them to do something pleasant. And in general, this is characterized by, even sometimes for many of these individuals, a worsening of their mood in the mornings. So they will see this pattern that in the morning, their depression is actually worse. And throughout the day, they actually start to get a little better. And they also have a lot of early awakenings. That's another accompanying symptom of melancholic depression, that they'll oftentimes wake up 2, 3, or 4 hours earlier than they wanted to, and they can't get back to sleep. And it's also characterized oftentimes by an excessive amount of guilt, whether or not you deserve it. They just feel guilty all the time. And as you might imagine, the melancholic depression can be difficult to treat because the individual is so hopeless and so despondent that they may not even engage in services during this type of episode.
To me, that sounds just like depression, except with a couple little added things in there, like the waking up early and having it be worse in the morning. Is that pretty much what it is, though?
I think it's worse than just like the average major depressive episode, which already is very severe.
Yes.
It's more that it is such a profound sense of despondency where you literally feel so hopeless that things are ever going to change. And obviously that can be a dimension of a lot of people with depression as well, but the hopelessness is so pervasive and the person's mood doesn't generally brighten almost at all. Now, people with major depressive disorder, they can still experience some mood reactivity from time to time, but people with melancholic depression, it's actually been shown that they actually have a whole different set of biology, that their brain operates in a different way, and there may be different biological substrates or underlying factors that predict a melancholic depression rather than a normal run-of-the-mill major depressive episode.
The treatment for melancholic depression is?
It's much harder to kind of get movement on the melancholic depression. So I always say that if you have a melancholic depression, you definitely need to visit with a psychiatrist and at least talk about medication options. Oftentimes the medications can help your mood lift just enough that you can engage more properly in the behavioral treatment. So you can feel motivated to actually try the behavioral treatments. Right. And just like atypical depression, sometimes the typical course of antidepressants doesn't work very well for you. There's been research that shows that melancholic depression does respond much better to SNRIs as well as TCAs, which are more atypical depression medications. And so definitely want to make sure that you give those a try. And in general, people with melancholic depression can get better, but they tend to have a longer course of therapy before they do, because you really have to loosen that hopelessness component. And because they have such sleep disturbance and again, that early awakening, adding a adjunctive cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia course as part of your behavioral treatment is very important too.
It would seem to me that because the melancholic depression is so difficult, or more difficult to treat, or excuse me, it would seem to me that because this type of depression is so severe, it would actually lead people into therapy quicker. Where the PDD, for example, is so low grade, maybe people just think this is how life is, there's no treatment for this. But is it the hopelessness that blocks them from seeing that there is actual recovery here?
Yes, and I think that that's part of the issue. When you don't believe that you can make positive change and that anything that you can do would make a difference, you won't engage.
Right.
And that's what happens with people with melancholic depression oftentimes, is they think, well, no matter what I do, it's not going to get better. Yeah. And so in some ways you have to jump that first hurdle first before you can actually start to see them doing and applying the skill sets that you're teaching them in therapy.
Yeah. Anyone who's experienced true depression understands how the risk of suicidal ideation can become apparent. Right. And you really just changed the way I thought about the complex topic of suicide and suicidal ideation in our series on suicidal ideation. Because you told me, you said, Kyle, people who are experiencing suicidal ideation are unable to see past their suffering. They can only see here. All they see is the suffering. They can't get past that. And that's what causes those thoughts.
Right.
So, and I feel so much of that similarities here with melancholic depression, because if you feel hopeless, you can't see past it. Even when my depression is really bad, I understand that it's my depression. And because I understand it's my depression, I know it can be treated.
Yes.
But to imagine feeling that way and not even understanding that there's a treatment on the other side.
Yes.
I mean, that's
I think
the
that's
worst.
the difficult thing about melancholic depression. And it's oftentimes it really does take a village. It takes a family and loved ones rallying around the individual to say, let's go to therapy.
Yeah.
You know, let's do this. But it can be very hard to be around somebody with melancholic depression because they are so hopeless and despondent. And sometimes you feel like they're being difficult, but it's really just the symptoms of the depression. So if you have a loved one who might be suffering from this, definitely give them a little bit more support just in the interim until they actually get to the place where they can see that hope again.